everyone, it's Karen at the Cool Tool Studio. Today I'm going to be demonstrating some methods for refining your precious metal clay pieces while they're in the Greenware state. This video is for those of you who are just getting started in precious metal clay and looking for some guidance on how to achieve the best possible surfaces on your pieces. Before I dive in with different methods, let's take a moment to talk about refining as a process and why it's helpful to spend some extra time on your work while it's in the Greenware phase. When I'm talking about sanding and refining, I'm addressing the removal of scratches and the evening out of the metal clay surface. When you're refining, the goal is to compress particles or to create progressively more fine scratches in the surface of the clay so that it becomes one even plane that can be brought up to a beautiful polish. A piece is shiny when it's polished because there aren't any high or low areas remaining on the surface to disrupt the distribution of light across the surface. This allows the reflective nature of the metal to, forgive the pun, really shine. I have here a piece that was sanded with just a fine sanding pad, which in our field is actually pretty coarse. You can see that the piece wasn't able to take on a full shine because the reflective nature of the silver is dulled by all the scratches on the surface. All is not lost. This piece could be sanded now that it's in its fired state. It'll just take quite a bit more time for you to sand it now than it would when it was in the Greenware state. When you're refining your pieces, no matter what method you're using, there are some general tips to keep in mind. Always make sure to always support your work. So if you're sanding this top face, either lay it down on something that you can sand against, maybe put it on an edge if you're going to be doing the side, or if you're sanding an edge, make sure that you're holding your piece close to the edge. If you're holding it all the way back here and sanding that edge, you're going to be stressing the work more than you would be if you're holding it close to that edge. It's also important to remember that when you are sanding edges, you're creating less stress on the piece if you follow the edge. If you were to be dragging up and down, again you'll be producing additional stress on this piece. Some clays are more flexible than others, and you might have to worry with some clay bodies more than others about breakage, but it's always a good practice to make sure that you're supporting your pieces while you're refining them. I'm going to be demonstrating these techniques today on a textured disc of Greenware Easy 960 clay. And it's also important when you're considering which refinement method you're going to choose that you consider what level of refinement does your piece require. When you're just rolling into textures, the clay is kind of compressing into that texture plate, and it actually doesn't really require a bunch of refinement. This piece was just rolled, fired, and put in the tumbler. I didn't do any sanding. If you look very closely, you can see there's a slight porous nature to the surface. This piece was refined before it was fired, and it is perfectly shiny. The difference is pretty minimal though. But if you were doing a piece where you had done additive work and you added some clay and then you used a higher grit sanding to remove some clay and introduce scratches to your work, then you would really want to spend some time refining your pieces. So always take some time to kind of evaluate your work and how much refinement you need to do before you consider which method you should choose. My go-to method and personal favorite for refining the surface of Greenware pieces is using these 3M sponge sanding pads. They have some flex to them, which is really nice for following rounded shapes. I love that they can be cut down to whatever size you need according to your project, and I like that they have a little bit of give, which helps me distribute pressure evenly to a piece while sanding. I also tend to be a little heavy-handed, so the give that the sanding pads have helps keep me from sanding away fine details and applying too much pressure. Another benefit to using these sanding pads is that as you're sanding, the metal clay dust will fall away from your piece and settle onto your work surface or can be brushed away with a brush. This makes it really easy to save it and reconstitute the clay. When using these sanding pads and any other sandpaper, you want to work your way from coarse to more fine. For these sanding pads, the order that you want to work with is from medium to fine to superfine, ultrafine, and then finally microfine. I don't really ever use medium or fine for refinement. I'll use them to sometimes remove material or shape my work. When I'm sanding, I generally like to start with superfine and work my way down to microfine. I'm going to show you how I like to use these sanding pads. I have them cut into smaller pieces since I'm working on a small piece. It gives me lots of control. And I have here the fine, So say I've got this little nick up here or something that I want to shape, I would start with Define, and that just disappears really quickly. You would probably only use Define if you had something slightly major to correct, but for the sake of this demo, I'm just showing you on this outside edge here. You can see how quickly it shapes the metal clay. But now I would be left with all these scratches on the surface. So instead of firing the piece like that, I'm going to work my way from fine down to progressively more fine sanding pads to get rid of those scratches and even up the surface. So I would go to super fine, and you again can see I'm not holding my piece all the way back here while I'm sanding that edge. I'm up and supporting my piece by where I'm sanding it. So I'm now using super fine, and I'm just sweeping along this edge. Again, not dragging up and down, but following this edge. And then my scratches are not as deep as they were when I used the fine. So now I'm going to move on to ultra fine and make smaller scratches. And then finally, microfine. In microfine, really it's, when you touch it, you can feel it's not really abrasive at all. So that's going to be a really fine surface that comes out of the tumbler beautifully once you have fired and tumbled your pieces. So this top surface has just been textured, and again, you might not necessarily feel like you have to spend that much time sanding this surface. This piece was fired with just being textured, and you can see it looks pretty good. There's one little nick there that I could have removed if I would have spent the time using sanding pads. So I always, just as a good practice, like to come in at least with the microfine sanding pad and run over my pieces before I decide to fire them. And this just ensures that if there are any scratches, they're going to be eliminated, and I'm going to have a nice surface. But since I didn't introduce any scratches by doing any shaping work, I don't feel the need to go all the way back up and start at super fine. So again, this technique is really nice because I can just dust away these sandings and then collect them and reconstitute them and use this clay again for another project. So those are sanding pads. Like I said, I really like them for the give that they have, and there's a lot of control when you're working with this technique. You can take your time with it and remove a little bit, evaluate, and see if you need to come back and remove some more. So this is one of my favorite techniques, but let's move on to talk about using damp refinement tools. I have here a collection of silicone clay shapers and then a piece of cut foam, and both of these can be used alongside water to even up your surface. This technique is perfect for redistributing clay from high areas to low areas. So when I'm looking at this edge, you can see that I didn't line things up perfectly, and there's a gap, and one side's a little bit higher than the other. So instead of sanding this even and then coming in and filling a gap, I can just take one of these tools, get it slightly damp, and damp is the key word here. If I were to take all this water on here and put it directly on my piece, I would be making a mess for myself. So I'm going to use my Wickway to remove some of the water, and then again kind of rub it on here to even it out on there and make sure I don't have too much. And then I'm just going to work in a circular motion on this edge to kind of massage the clay and soften it. As I'm doing this, the clay is getting soft and then moving from the high area to the low areas. So I'm filling that gap and I'm lining up that edge all in one go. So that's really handy, and this technique is perfect for that. I really like these silicone tools because the clay doesn't stick to them, so it's really easy to wipe it off and kind of create a little pile of paste that you can save. And these smaller tools are perfect because they have different edges, so you can pick the edge that meets your needs. And I also really like working with these tools on small faces. So it wouldn't really make sense for me to try to use this tiny tool to even out this larger surface, because I could apply a little more pressure here and then not as much pressure up here and kind of make things worse than they were. So on that note, I've got this foam. It has this nice flat face on it, so if I'm trying to work a bigger surface, like say if this was scratched up and I'm trying to even it out, I could take this tool, again damp and not wet, and bring it across. And you can use this method to refine textured surfaces. I'm not excellent at it, if we're being honest. It's something that I'm working on. I find that I overwork pieces when I try to do textured surfaces with this method. Again, the point of it is to bring clay from high areas to low areas. So if you have a really fine texture and you introduce too much moisture like that, and then you're trying to even up this top face, you're going to be filling in your lower areas. So this technique is great for cleaning up edges and evening up discrepancies in your surfaces, but it wouldn't be my go-to method for refining textured surfaces. And part of that has to do with the clay body that I'm working with. EZ960 really quickly absorbs water. So you can see it's been sitting here, and if I go over this clay has softened so much that that texture is gone. So I've seen people use these tools really beautifully on textured surfaces, but they might just have a lighter hand than I do and might have better water control. So you just want to make sure that you're practicing these techniques before you were to apply it to a beautifully textured surface on a piece that you've spent a lot of time with. People do use this for a final finish on their pieces, but just as a side note, as I said earlier, EZ960 really quickly absorbs water, and it kind of gives it a porous surface. This piece I fired after doing the damp refinement method, and I didn't do any sanding afterwards or anything, and you can kind of see that the introduction of water to this clay body kind of gives it a porous look. So this technique might be best used on EZ960 when you're cleaning up an edge or evening up a surface and doing some major moving and then following it up with sanding pads. This surface was a piece that was sanded with sanding pads after it was refined using wet refinement, and you can see that it's got a little more of a shine to it. Another method that you can use to refine your pieces while they are in the Greenware state is using baby wipes. And this technique works similarly to the damp foam, but the dampness is contained in the wipes. So that's really helpful, and it helps keep you from using too much water. I have here a really fresh wipe straight from the package, and again, you have to be kind of careful with pressure while you're using this technique to clean up surfaces. If you push too hard and you spend a lot of time in one area and really introduce a good amount of liquid to that area, it's going to progressively get softer and softer and softer. So be wary of overworking your pieces with this technique. But it's a really nice way to, again, kind of bring any high areas down to the low areas. So we're evening out this top surface right now. And again, would be ideal for cleaning up edges if you had a join on an edge that you were trying to even up. But they're also nice because you can kind of compress and bend them around edges here and round them out a little bit. And they can also be wrapped around fingers, so you can apply a little more pressure, or folded up to work kind of like the sanding pad where there's some more give and you won't be applying as much pressure. That could help you kind of distribute it evenly. But again, as you can see, if I overwork this area and introduce a lot of moisture and then think, oh, well, maybe there's still a scratch there, and spend a lot of time on it, I'm going to be erasing my texture. So make sure you're gentle when you're using this technique. Here's one that's kind of been sitting out. It's drier, and that'll kind of give you an extra level of control. You can see the clay isn't taking on nearly as much water, and it won't move as quickly. So maybe experiment with how fresh your baby wipes are. Maybe leave one out for a couple of hours before you get going to see if things work better for you one way or another. One of the drawbacks of using this technique is that unlike the sanding pads where you're accumulating dust that you can refine, the clay particles are contained in this wipe now. You can't get that back to refine it. So you would have to either send it off to a refining company where they'd be burning away the wipes and collecting the silver for you and then giving you money back or a balance for purchasing silver in the future. but you don't get the immediate reconstitution of your silver like you do with other methods. The final method of refinement that I'm going to be sharing with you today is burnishing. Burnishing is bringing a piece to a polish by compressing the particles by pushing the high areas down to be even with the low areas. This technique can be tricky because it does require a good amount of force, so you want to make sure your piece is supported on a work surface. So I have an arrangement of tools here. This is an agate burnisher. This is, I think, called a needle and lace tool, but it's got this really nice face here that I like to use for burnishing. And then just some ball burnishers, and then this is just a random shaping steel tool that I had laying around as well. And all of these will be fine for different burnishing and be more appropriate at different times than others. Just as a warning, when you are grabbing random tools around your studio and seeing if this works for you, be wary of aluminum tools. Aluminum tools such as drying forms and cutters and tools that you could use to burnish potentially have a corrosive impact on silver precious metal clay. So be wary of aluminum in your studio. So again, here I've got this tool that has this really nice face on it, and that's going to be good for pushing clay down on a flat face. And you can already kind of see, that's another reason why I really like this method. It's very easy to tell where you have burnished and brought material down, because you can see it shining up. Sometimes when you're sanding and using other methods of refinement, it's hard to see when it's in the Greenware state, like where you have worked and how that surface is looking. Again, this is like a really safe, this was just a flat disc without any texture or high areas. You'd want to use a bigger tool, because again, you could kind of overwork if you were trying to use a ball burnisher and pushing down to burnish. You could push much harder here than up here and kind of have some discrepancies in your surface. So on a big surface like that, you could maybe bring this to an edge and kind of have an angle and burnish your surface that way. And again, make sure your pieces are supported for this technique, because it's a compression technique and it does require a good amount of force. So these little ball tools, ball burnishers, have smaller ends, and if you really wanted to get inside of shape, you could use them for that. Again, this tool, it's got this kind of edge here, so maybe you want to burnish corner. It would be perfect for that. And then sometimes, it's like with this tool, if it's just laying on my bench, I tend to just grab whatever's handy. So instead of getting out a burnisher, if I'm burnishing a side here, this tool, you can just kind of run it along that edge. So there's plenty of tools at your disposal for this technique, and the general idea is again to just compress the clay and push any of the high areas down to the low areas. And again, this technique is really nice because you can see the effects of your work and what areas might need more work. And when you do fire and tumble your pieces, you get an absolutely beautiful high shine surface. So this technique is really good if you want something that's super shiny. These are 4 methods that can be used in refining your pieces. It's important to consider the nature of your piece, how much clay you have to move, what kind of surface you're refining, and even how sensitive your clay body is to water when choosing a refining method. I recommend giving them all a try to find the technique that works best for you. I might be too heavy-handed for baby wipes, but it may be your favorite method to use. You may find that using damp foam or silicone is perfect for the clay body you're working with, or love the control of sanding pads. Whatever method you end up using, I hope that this video was helpful and provides you with some knowledge to help you confidently move forward in your metal clay practice. Thanks for watching.